today I'm going to show you how to paint this night beach scene right at dusk where the sun has just set. And I have already traced on my watercolor paper the sand and the horizon line based on the template that you get in your kit. You don't have to follow the template if you don't want to. You can go ahead and make your sand whatever shape you want or put your horizon line in a different place, but you just want to make sure that it's not right exactly in the middle. It comes out a lot more interesting and dynamic if your horizon line is either lower than the center or higher. I would suggest lower so that you have lots of room to make the sunset. Also in your kit, you got a palette of watercolor paints and a variety of sizes of brushes. So the first thing we're going to do is take our largest flat brush and make a wash. And what a wash is it's just when you add a lot of water to a colored paint and use that as the base for your picture. We're going to do this mostly in blue, but we're also going to add some other colors near the center for our sunset. So I'm going to start by taking a blue and just adding a lot of water to it. And then I'm starting at the top of my paper and I'm just brushing in the same direction, going across back and forth. You can also go with some water and get your paper a little bit pre-wet to help the wash flow a little bit better. And this is also good if you're someone that tends to put your paint on really dark. Going ahead and getting your paper wet first for the wash will help avoid that. And so I'm adding the blue until I have a couple inches above my horizon line. And then I'm going to rinse off my brush and I'm going to add a wash of a little bit of pink, and I'm overlapping with my blue. And I'm doing this because when two colors are wet with watercolor, they automatically bleed into each other. So by overlapping and making them touch, I'm getting this nice gradation from blue to pink. And I'm also going to add a little bit of yellow, and I'm getting it really light. And then I'm going ahead and adding that yellow up to the horizon line, overlapping with the pink again for the same reason. So now we have a really nice gradation from blue to pink to yellow. And rinsing off my brush, I'm actually also going to add some more blue down here. I'm going to give this a chance to dry and start at the bottom and work my way up to the top. And this might seem a little odd to add blue underneath where there's going to be the brown sand, but because it's a night scene at dusk and it kind of gives a dark blue cast over everything, we actually want some of that blue to be mixed with the sand. So when you put the brown over, you're still going to see a little bit of that blue showing through. And I'm bringing that blue right up to that line where there's the yellow, and you can even hold your brush at a 90-degree angle and just using the tip kind of trace over that line to get a nice clean edge, and then go ahead and spread out your wash underneath. And so now once you have this base down, then you want to let it completely dry before you start adding things over top to avoid it all bleeding together. And you can either just wait, or you can hold your paper up and kind of air it out just in the open air. Or if you have access to a blow dryer, you can go ahead and blow dry it, and that will hurry the drying time along. So the next thing we're going to do is just fill in the base layer of the light brown for the sand. So we're using our medium-sized flat brush because we do just want an even base coat to start. We're not worrying about texture yet. But we're not using our large one because we want it to have a small enough brush to get in these little details of the tendrils of the sand banks that are going into the water. So I'm going to go ahead and add some water to this lighter brown paint. And this is a little bit of a different brown than you usually use for sand. It's a little bit darker, but because it's at night, again, everything's going to be a little bit darker, so we want to keep consistent for that effect. And similar to how we filled in our background wash, we're just going back and forth in the same direction with our brush. I'm just filling in our shape, following whatever outline that you made. And you kind of tilt your brush a little bit of an angle when you get to these thinner parts, and that's going to help you get those smaller lines that you need to fill in the detailed shapes. So now you can go ahead and just leave that to dry for now. And to let that dry, we're going to actually move up to adding some detail near the top of the picture now with the clouds. And we're going to move to this different area just to allow for the sand to dry before we put any detail with the water, because we don't want our colors down there to bleed together. So for the clouds, we're going to be using a round brush. The round brushes are good for pretty easy, any rounded shapes, and especially for creating texture. So these are going to be perfect for making the clouds. And clouds can be kind of difficult, but the clouds that are darker and more colorful, such as with sunrise and sunsets, are easier because you don't have to worry about leaving white space. And the clouds that we'll be doing right now are very impressionistic, so we're not going to worry about adding a lot of detail. We're really just going to make blobs of color almost, but when we layer them all together, they're going to give the impression of clouds. So I'm going to use the same blue that I laid down for the wash, and I'm just adding a little bit of water to it so that it's darker this time. And then I'm going to move across the top of my page in circular motions. And I'm going to keep getting my brush wet and just overlapping these circular forms for some of the dark clouds near the top of the sky. And this is what's really neat about watercolor, is that even by using the same exact color, just by adding more or less water, you get completely different values. So you can make a lot of variation within a single color just based on how much water you use. And you can also build up darker tones by layering the same color over top of each other. So now that I have this top area filled in with clouds, I'm going to rinse off my brush and tap off the extra water, and I'm going to use that same circular motion and just go along the edge of the clouds I just made. And this is going to blur the edges and make them look a lot more light and fluffy. We don't want any hard edges on our clouds. Another thing to keep in mind while you're making clouds is you don't want them to be even. You want them to get thinner and thicker. And so if you lean back and kind of look at your picture and see that all your clouds look really symmetrical and all look the same even size, then you want to go ahead and go in and add some variation to them. That's what's going to make them look a lot more natural. And so now we have our dark clouds at the top, and we're going to start adding some of our little smaller colorful clouds that are in the distance that are near the horizon line. So I'm going to start with some pink. I'm using the same pink that I used for the background wash, but just adding less water this time. I'm just going to add some of these pink clouds, kind of angling my brush to the side a little bit and still using a circular motion, but I'm angling my brush like that so that they come out really small and thin as opposed to the thick kind of poofier clouds that we have near the top. And I'm just adding some skinny kind of stretched out pink clouds coming in from each side. You don't want to overdo it, so you can just add a couple to start. And then I'm rinsing off my brush and doing the same thing where I'm just going over with a wet brush and using the same kind of motion, but I'm just blurring out the edges of my clouds. And I'm moving my brush up and down in these circular motions to draw out the shape to make it less even. So I'm going along here and I'm kind of pulling some of that pink from my clouds down and pulling some up and just purposefully making the edges really uneven. And now we're also going to add a little bit of orange. And you don't have to wait for this to dry in between because we do want these colors to blend actually in this case. So if they bleed into each other, that would be okay. So I'm adding a good amount of water to my orange because we don't want the orange to go on there too dark. I'm just tapping off some of the extra paint on my paper towel. And I'm going in and using the same technique. I'm just adding some orange here and there. And you can go ahead even and overlap some of your pink clouds and layer over. And you can really place your clouds wherever you want. And you can put as many or as few as you want. So if you want yours a little more sparse and have a little bit of a clear sky, you don't have to put as many clouds as I'm putting. Everyone's picture can turn out different. So now I'm rinsing out my brush and doing the same thing I did with the pink clouds, where I'm using the same circular motion and still holding my brush in angle, but I'm just blurring out any of those rough edges. And this just makes the clouds look a lot more light and fluffy and more like real clouds. And you'll see I'm not making any specific shapes. It's really just kind of smeared areas of color, and that's going to give the impression of clouds still. So you don't have to get super technical or detailed about this. Then the last thing I'm going to add is some lighter blue. So I'm going to use a different blue than I used for the darker clouds up there. I'm going to go ahead and use some of this lighter kind of periwinkle blue and just add a couple of those in there. And I'm overlapping these clouds with the brighter pink and orange ones. I'm not adding as much of this dark color, just a little bit in here to break it up a little bit. So I've just added a couple, and then I'm rinsing off my brush again and doing the same process with these, where I'm just blurring out any hard edges that I see. This is something that's going to take a lot of practice, so even if before you go ahead on your actual picture, if you want to just have a little piece of scrap paper next to you and kind of test out some cloud shapes, you can always do that. So now our sky is done actually. I said we're leaving this simple and more impressionistic. So we're going to leave our sky alone now and go on to adding some of the detail to the water. And for the water now, we want streaks that kind of look like blended darker blue lines to imply the ripples on the surface of the water. So for this, since we want thinner straight lines, we're going to switch back to our medium-sized flat brush. And flat brushes are what's going to give us those nice straight thin lines. So I'm going to ahead and adding some water to the original blue that we used, the same one that's in the background and that we used for the darker clouds up top. And now I'm just going to start by darkening up this horizon line on the edges. So I'm just holding my brush at an angle so I can get a nice straight outline, and I'm just following that little pencil line I already made when I traced it, and just leaving this brightest part at the center without an outline, but I'm going to both edges and just making some short streaks in that darker blue color along the edges of the paper, just leaving that center open. And so it looks kind of funny right now, and you just see these bold, harsh, dark blue lines. So I'm gonna rinse off my brush and tap off the extra water. And then I'm gonna go ahead and smooth right over. I'm gonna keep adding water and just smudge all these outlines I just made. And they'll still stay dark where the original color was first put down. They'll stay darker even as you smudge it. So I can still see those original lines, but they're just a little bit lighter and a little more blurry. Because while the paint's still wet, I've just smudged straight over with the flat side of my brush. And you can keep rinsing your brush off periodically as you keep smearing those lines. And that just helps you from getting too much dark color built up on your paintbrush. And so as you can see, it's not as hard as it looks to make water. So you have the impression of the subtle ripples on the water just by putting some lines and then spreading them out and smearing them with our wet brush. And now we're also going to add a little more texture to the sand. And so I'm going to take my round brush because we want to create more texture, and we're not going to do lines in the sand. We're going to make something that's a little more spotted, similar to our clouds. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of water to that same brown I used earlier. And I'm not adding as much water as we did for our base, so it's going to be a little darker. And then every so often, I'm just going to stamp up and down and make some darker textured areas with my round brush. And this technique is called stippling. And this is a really great technique for any time you want to add a repetitive texture. So you'll use this a lot too when you're painting trees or bushes or plants. It's great for grass, just any sort of background where you want a little more texture. So you see, I'm not putting it everywhere. I'm just adding some little areas every so often. And it doesn't look too great right now. It looks a little funny and kind of more like big blotchy polka dots. So what we're going to do is rinse off our brush and then do the same technique over where we're stippling and stamping up and down right over the brown that we just put down. And we're just going to blend it and spread it out with that water. So anytime you add any sort of texture, whether it's a stippling or whether it's more of the straight line sort of streaks like we did in the water, and you want to blend it out a little bit more, make it more subtle, you can just go ahead and brush water over it. So now we have the texture of sand, and it doesn't just look flat anymore. It added a lot of dimension to it just by doing that stippling technique. And now the last thing that we're going to do is just add some more details with our smallest brush. So we're going to use our fine detail brush to add just the impression of a walkway to a little tiny lighthouse, a little fence. You can put a boat if you want, a little flag. And I'm going to show you how to do what I did, but again, you can add anything you want. You can do some silhouettes of little palm trees if you want to make it more tropical. It's really up to you. Or even if you like your painting exactly how it is right now and at this step just want to leave it, you can go ahead and do that as well. So everyone's picture can turn out a little bit differently. But if you want to add some details, I use that same blue we've been using and just put a little bit of water in it. And I'm using this tiny brush for the details. And what I did to start was I just went along the edge of my sand up here. I just went ahead and I traced a thin line. And then I went ahead and put another line a little bit above it. And then I went ahead and just really quick and put some little short kind of spokes coming up. And they do not have to be perfect, because again, this is just giving the impression. So you don't have to worry about them being perfectly evenly spaced or perfectly straight. I'm really just tapping really fast up and down and making little short streaks, because this is just the impression of a fence and a walkway. So then I decided where I wanted my lighthouse to be. Again, you don't want anything right exactly in the middle. It just looks a lot more interesting if you keep everything a bit off center. So I went ahead and put my lighthouse over here, and all I did was I made a little cylinder with a point on top. So just using the very tip of my brush, I just made a simple little cylinder with a point on top, real tiny, that's it. So again, just an impression. And then from there, I made kind of a wavy line trailing down and meeting up with that other fence. And then I just put some little spokes coming out from it every so often. So we just have this broken line with just some little short points coming up from it. And then I went ahead and put a flag near the end here. So just a little line going up, and then a little wavy triangle just using the tip of my brush to imply a flag. And I actually was inspired by a photo I took when I went to Tawas earlier in the summer to create this painting. So that's something else you can do. If you have photos from when you've gone to different beaches, you can kind of use that for inspiration as to what little details that you want to add to your picture. And then I had this blank space over here, so I decided to add a little boat. So for that, again, I'm keeping it really simple. And I just made a rectangle with kind of angled edges here. So I have the edges curving up at an angle for just the basic bottom shape of the boat, just like when you draw a boat when you were a little kid. You can keep it really simple. And then I put a little line coming up with a small triangle up top for the flag. And then I put another triangle out of the one side for the sail, and I made the other sail kind of curving like it was blowing in the wind. So I made like a curved line for the other part of the sail. And so just a really simple basic silhouette of a boat. And then that's it. You can feel free to add like little birds flying, which you can, if you want, which you can go ahead and just make two little arches to imply some birds. You can really add anything you want to this, and just making sure to just keep it simple and don't overthink it. And we're just trying to create the impression of a scene. Thank you for painting this beach scene with me. I hope you had fun. Remember as you're working that this is meant to be impressionistic, so you can really just have fun with the colors and shapes, and you don't have to overthink it or be too technical or too hard on yourself as you're working. So remember with the clouds to just keep them uneven and random. Make sure that they don't look too symmetrical. Just really try to vary your circular motions. And when you're adding the details, if you choose to add those, you're just making impressions. So just make sure that you keep working with simple geometric shapes, and you'll have an awesome picture when you're done.